Emily Carter never thought her life would split in two over a quiet cup of coffee, yet that was exactly where it began, in a small cafe near her office in Seattle, where rain tapped softly against the windows and the world outside seemed unaware that something fragile was about to break. She sat across from Daniel Brooks, her hands wrapped around a mug she had no intention of drinking, her heart beating faster than the calm expression on her face suggested, because she had already crossed a line she once believed was unmovable, and now all that remained was fear and hope tangled together. Emily was not a reckless woman, she was careful, organized, and dependable, the kind of person her coworkers trusted and her husband, Mark, relied on without question. Her marriage had not exploded or collapsed dramatically, instead, it had slowly faded into routine silence, where conversations were polite but distant and affection felt more like memory than reality. Daniel entered her life quietly, not as a temptation, but as a presence, someone who listened when she spoke, who noticed when she looked tired, who asked questions and waited for honest answers. Over time, Emily found herself feeling seen again, and that feeling grew dangerous before she fully understood it. One late evening after work, when the building was nearly empty and the city lights blurred through the windows, a single moment of weakness turned into a choice she would spend months replaying in her mind. There was no drama, no passion-filled escape, just two adults who let loneliness guide them somewhere they should not have gone. The next morning, guilt settled into Emily's chest like a weight she couldn't shake, and she knew she could never undo what had happened, only decide how to live with it. That was why she asked Daniel to meet her, why her voice shook slightly when she leaned forward and said, very clearly, that no one else could ever know. She told him it would destroy her marriage, her job, her life, and Daniel looked at her with an expression she took for understanding, even care. He promised he would keep her secret, said he never wanted to hurt her, and for a brief moment, Emily believed she was safe. She went back to her routine, answering emails, attending meetings, cooking dinner beside a husband who trusted her completely, all while carrying a truth that pressed against her conscience every waking hour. The fear never left, but it softened enough for her to breathe, enough for her to believe that mistakes could remain contained if handled carefully. At work, Daniel acted normal, friendly but distant, and that helped Emily convince herself the danger had passed. Yet small things began to feel off, glances that lingered too long, conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, a tension she couldn't explain but felt in her body before her mind could name it. She told herself she was imagining things, that guilt had made her sensitive, that secrets often feel louder inside our heads than they are in reality. Still, late at night, when Mark slept beside her, Emily stared at the ceiling and wondered why Daniel had looked so serious lately, why his promise echoed in her memory with a strange, uncertain tone. She reminded herself that Daniel was honest, that he believed in truth, and that belief comforted and scared her at the same time. Emily didn't know that for Daniel, the secret had already begun to change shape, turning from something he carried for her into something he carried for himself, heavy and restless. She didn't know that his silence was not peace, but pressure. And as she finished her coffee and stood to leave the cafe that day, thanking him again for understanding, Emily walked back into her life unaware that the ground beneath it had already started to crack, that trust, once placed in the wrong hands, rarely breaks loudly at first, and that the promise Daniel made so easily would soon become the beginning of everything she was about to lose. The change did not come with noise or warning, but Emily felt it the moment she walked into the office on Monday morning and sensed a cold distance that had not been there before, as if the air itself had learned something she had not been told. People smiled less, conversations ended quickly, and the easy rhythm of her workday felt strained, like a song played slightly off beat. She focused on her tasks, answered emails, and reminded herself that fear could create shadows where none existed, yet every glance toward Daniel filled her with quiet dread. He avoided her eyes now, spoke carefully, and carried himself with a tightness that suggested something unresolved. Days passed, and the tension grew sharper. Her manager stopped asking for her input, meetings were rescheduled without explanation, and whispers followed her down hallways she once walked with confidence. Emily tried to reason through it, telling herself that work stress affected everyone, but the truth pressed closer each hour, heavy and unavoidable. On Thursday afternoon, an unexpected email summoned her to a meeting with Human Resources, and her heart sank before she even read the subject line. The room was small and brightly lit, and the calm tone of the HR representative felt unreal as words like professionalism, trust, and boundaries filled the space. They did not accuse her loudly or shame her openly, but the message was clear: something had been shared, and it had consequences. Emily realized then that Daniel had spoken, not to the whole world, but enough for the truth to slip beyond her control. She did not defend herself or offer excuses. Her voice stayed steady as she accepted responsibility, though inside she felt like she was falling through open air. By lunchtime, her badge was collected, her desk emptied into a box, and the career she had built with patience and care was reduced to a quiet goodbye. Walking out of the building, Emily felt exposed, as if everyone could see the story written on her face. That evening, the truth reached her home as well, carried by rumors that traveled faster than honesty ever could. Mark sat across from her at the kitchen table, his expression confused and wounded, asking questions she could not escape. Emily told him the truth without drama, because lies had already done enough damage, and as she spoke, she watched the trust in his eyes fade into something distant and final. There was no shouting, no anger, just a deep sadness that settled between them, heavy and permanent. Mark packed a bag and left that night, saying he needed space, and Emily did not stop him because she knew some spaces cannot be crossed again once they open. The days that followed blurred together in silence and shock, messages went unanswered, friends grew distant, and the world she once belonged to seemed to close its doors without looking back. Daniel never called, never explained, and Emily understood then that his version of honesty had come at the cost of her stability. Alone in her apartment, surrounded by quiet, she replayed every choice, every word, every moment that led her there, wishing she had been stronger, wiser, more careful. Yet regret offered no comfort, only clarity. Emily had trusted the wrong person with the wrong truth, and now she stood in the wreckage of that decision, jobless, heartbroken, and facing a future she never imagined, knowing that sometimes the hardest part of a mistake is not the fall itself, but the realization that once trust is broken, it rarely breaks evenly, and someone is almost always left carrying more than their share. Emily's world had already collapsed by the time Daniel came back into it, and the silence that followed her firing was louder than any argument she had ever imagined, because once the job was gone and her marriage stood broken and distant, there was nothing left to distract her from the weight of what she had done and what had been done to her. Days passed quickly but felt empty, and nights stretched endlessly as she sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by furniture that suddenly felt borrowed, like a life she no longer fully owned. She avoided calls, ignored messages, and stopped explaining herself, because every explanation sounded like an excuse even when it wasn't. Emily wasn't trying to be a victim, but she couldn't ignore how completely she had been pushed out of the world she once belonged to. People she had worked with for years no longer reached out, and friends who once laughed with her now kept their distance, unsure of what to say or afraid of being close to someone marked by scandal. She accepted the isolation because fighting it felt pointless, and somewhere deep inside, she believed she deserved at least part of it. Still, guilt didn't erase the pain of betrayal, and that truth sat heavy in her chest. When Daniel finally showed up at her door one quiet evening, she almost didn't answer, but something about unfinished words pulled her forward. He looked tired, older than before, his confidence worn thin, and for the first time since everything fell apart, Emily saw fear in his eyes instead of certainty. He spoke slowly, choosing each word like it might cut, and admitted that the secret had eaten at him, that he believed honesty was the only way to survive it, even if it destroyed something else along the way. Emily listened without interrupting, her emotions shifting between anger, sadness, and a strange, unwanted understanding, because she knew Daniel hadn't acted out of cruelty, but out of his own weakness, just as she had when everything began. She told him she had lost her job, her marriage, and nearly every connection that once made her feel stable, and Daniel's face fell as if he was only now grasping the full weight of his actions. He apologized, not dramatically, not desperately, but quietly, and that made it harder for Emily to hold on to her anger. She wanted to scream, to ask why her life had to be the price of his truth, but instead she found herself saying she didn't hate him, because hatred required energy she no longer had. What hurt most wasn't just the consequences, but the realization that the person she trusted with her most fragile truth had chosen relief over loyalty. They talked for hours, not about fixing anything, but about how easy it is for two lonely people to mistake connection for safety, and how quickly that illusion can fall apart. Emily admitted that she had felt invisible long before Daniel noticed her, and that the attention, the listening, the feeling of being understood had clouded her judgment. Daniel confessed that he had wanted to be the good man, the honest one, without fully thinking about who would pay the price for that image. As the night deepened, there was a soft pull between them, not desire, but shared regret, a quiet recognition of each other's flaws that felt intimate in its own way. Yet Emily knew, with painful clarity, that whatever they had shared was finished, not because of rules or morality, but because trust had been broken beyond repair. She understood then that forgiveness did not mean reopening doors, and that caring about someone did not always mean keeping them close. When Daniel finally stood to leave, the air between them felt heavy with words unsaid, but Emily didn't stop him, because some endings need space to become real. After he left, she sat alone again, but something inside her had shifted, the anger had softened into clarity, and she saw that while she could accept her mistakes, she didn't have to carry everyone else's guilt too. In the weeks that followed, Emily began walking more, letting movement quiet her thoughts, watching the city continue without her involvement, and slowly understanding that being seen once did not mean she would never be seen again. She started writing at night, putting her feelings into words she never planned to share, discovering that honesty with herself felt safer than honesty with the wrong person. Emily wasn't healed, not even close, but she was learning that loss could coexist with growth, and that being alone did not mean being erased. By facing Daniel and hearing the truth from his own mouth, she closed a chapter. She had been stuck inside, and while the future still felt uncertain and fragile, she knew one thing with certainty now: she would never again give someone the power to decide her worth, her story, or her silence. Emily's life did not suddenly become better when she left Seattle, but it became quieter, and that quiet slowly gave her room to breathe, because starting over in Vancouver meant no one knew her story unless she chose to tell it, no one looked at her with judgment already formed, and no one expected her to explain herself. She rented a small apartment near the water, nothing fancy, just enough space to feel like her own, and every morning she walked along the harbor watching people rush to work, realizing she was no longer in a hurry to prove anything. The job she found was modest, but honest, and her coworkers treated her like a person, not a rumor, which felt strange at first, like kindness she hadn't earned, but over time she learned to accept it without guilt. Nights were the hardest, because silence has a way of bringing old memories back, and Emily often thought about Mark, not with longing, but with regret, wishing she had been braver sooner, wishing she had spoken before breaking instead of after. She did not try to defend her choices anymore, she simply accepted them as part of her story, and that acceptance gave her strength she never had before. Writing became her anchor, a way to place her thoughts somewhere safe, and through words she began to understand that she was more than her worst mistake, more than the way people had turned away from her. She heard about Daniel once, through someone she barely knew, and instead of anger, she felt distance, like hearing about a chapter already closed, and that told her she was finally moving forward. Emily stopped measuring her worth by who stayed and who left, and started measuring it by how honestly she lived each day. She learned that being alone did not mean being unloved, that healing did not require forgiveness from everyone, only truth with herself. Slowly, her laughter returned, softer than before, but real, and when she looked at her reflection, she no longer saw a woman defined by shame, but someone who survived loss, judgment, and loneliness without becoming bitter. Emily's ending was not dramatic, not perfect, and not wrapped in romance, but it was steady, and it was hers, and for the first time since everything fell apart, she trusted herself enough to believe that this new life, built carefully and quietly, was enough.